Thank you for choosing to watch this brief video update. I'm sure you will not only find this the most astounding information you have ever learned, but you'll also find the conclusion absolutely shocking. It becomes increasingly interesting as the video develops, so be patient in the beginning minutes, especially if you are already familiar with the information. Make sure you watch this video to its end. I promise you it becomes exponentially more astounding as the video progresses. In other words, I'm about to demonstrate how all of the many major signs over the last number of years, many of which you may not be aware of currently, all finally tie together and connect to complete a massive, beautiful canvas God has been painting. It is indescribable how amazing this all is. The bigger picture has come into focus. In other words, you will be blown away by the end. I want to make this video as short as possible so that people will choose to watch it. So I'm going to speak quickly and cover a lot of information in a short period. It isn't complicated information, but you'll need to pay close attention to everything said. Make sure you are in a position to be able to focus while watching this. If you need to adjust the speed of the video, you are able to do so in the settings feature on the lower right side of the screen. First, I will very quickly summarize 4 of the major prophetic signs that occurred this autumn. For amazing details on these signs, you need to watch my video number 5. After this brief summary, I will then explain the absolutely amazing and shocking update. If you have watched my recent update videos I made and are very familiar with the information, you could skip to minute 36 if you wish, or you could watch again a quick summary of the major amazing signs this last year and familiarize yourself again with the concepts, which would be a good idea as the information in this video progressively builds on itself. The Revelation 12 sign in a nutshell. The, quote, great sign in heaven, quote, in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, is the sign of the rapture. The rapture is the event before the end times period of 7 years that comes before the 1,000 years messianic age. The rapture is when the overcomers and faithful followers of Jesus disappear, sparing them from the coming tribulation. Widely available modern astronomy software allows anyone to easily view and animate the night sky at any time in history or the future. For example, we now know what the Star of Bethlehem was and how it lines up with all 9 clues in the book of Matthew. The discovery of what it was explains, for example, why the Magi from Babylon knew about it and everyone else didn't, and also how the star stopped over Bethlehem on December 25th, 2 BC. The details are in my video number 5. The Revelation 12 sign, that is the rapture sign, is a celestial alignment in the night sky with many moving parts that make it so rare it occurs only once in all of human history. This includes a 42-week circular retrograde motion of Jupiter strictly inside the womb of the constellation Virgo. This Revelation 12 sign occurred on September 23rd. The details are in my video number 5. Quote, a woman clothed in the sun, quote. The sun is in Virgo for almost a month every year from late August to September, quote, with the moon under her feet, quote. This addition to the sign narrows down the possible dates for this sign to a couple days per year around the autumnal equinox, quote, and a crown of 12 stars, quote. Above Virgo is Leo, which is associated with Christ's royal lineage in the Bible and is made up of 9 principal stars. Mercury, Mars, and Venus make this 12 stars and makes this sign exceedingly rare. The planets also line up symmetrically, and Mercury, the messenger planet, makes a perfect retrograde motion around Regulus, which is known as the King Star. Quote, she was pregnant and crying out in birth pains, quote. Jupiter, which is the Messiah planet to the Jews, does an exceedingly rare retrograde motion inside the womb for 42 weeks, which is a regular human gestation. This addition to the sign makes it once in human history. The Great American Eclipse. The Great American Eclipse passed over the entire continental U.S. on August 21st. As you will see, this was a sign of impending judgment on America. Genesis 1:14 says the, quote, lights in the expanse of the heavens are for prophetic signs and appointed times, quote. The, quote, grand coincidence, quote, is the name scientists use to refer to the fact that the sun is exactly 400 times larger than the moon and also exactly 400 times further away, producing perfect solar eclipses. Like the Roman and Greek alphabets, each letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a numeric value. The numeric value of the last letter is 400. Additionally, each letter is a symbol for something. This last letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the symbol for prophetic signs. So unless they knew modern astronomy 3,000 years ago, whoever created the Hebrew alphabet also created eclipses. Here in point form is a list of the things about this eclipse. This eclipse's path is an uncanny division of the nation in half. The eclipse only touched the U.S. and no other country or island. The last time an eclipse only touched the U.S. was in 1776, the year the nation was founded, which is fitting if this sign indicates the end of the nation as we know it. The first minute the eclipse's path of totality first cast its shadow of darkness on the west coast in Oregon was the exact same minute of sunset in Israel. The same applies to darkness first touching Salem, Oregon, and sunset in Jerusalem. The path of totality went directly over 7 cities named Salem. 7 is used over 500 times in the Bible to show God's touch upon something. The word Salem is Hebrew for peace. The sun going to darkness would imply no peace. Salem, Kentucky is exactly where the eclipse peaked. The eclipse entered the U.S. in Oregon, the 33rd state, and exited the U.S. on the 33rd parallel in South Carolina. The eclipse occurred 33 days before the Revelation 12 sign. Where the eclipse peaked is coincidentally exactly in the path of totality of the next great American eclipse that divides the U.S. in half 7 years from now, this time going from south to north. The paths of both eclipses together form an X or a cross or a Tav mark. Tav is the name of the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet that has a numeric value of 400 and is the symbol for prophetic signs. In Ezekiel chapter 9, a Tav mark was placed on the foreheads of those with a loyalty and zeal for God. Their lives were spared during the judgment and destruction of Jerusalem, while those without this shibboleth were not spared. This is a prophetic foreshadow of the coming mark of the beast. Where the great American eclipse peaked is the epicenter of the New Madrid seismic zone, the location of the strongest earthquakes in U.S. history. The path of totality went directly over all of the seismic hot zones in the U.S. The date of the eclipse was the first day of the month of Elul in the Jewish calendar. This is 40 days before the Day of Atonement and is the beginning of what is called the season of repentance. After the Day of Atonement, it is too late to atone for sin. There were two other famous eclipses in history that occurred on Elul 1, the beginning of the season of repentance. The Bur-Sigil eclipse in 763 BC is the most documented and famous eclipse in ancient history. It passed directly over ancient Nineveh just before Jonah arrived to preach 40 days of repentance or else judgment and destruction for the city. In the Bible, Jonah is recorded as being a contemporary of the king of Nineveh at this time. The discovery of the eponym cuneiform tablets revealed there were 2 plagues and a civil war in Nineveh in the 2 years leading up to the eclipse. These calamities in the eclipse prior to Jonah arriving explains why the Ninevites were mysteriously more than ready to receive Jonah's warning and repent, even though Jonah was a stranger and from the enemy tribe. In 1914, another famous eclipse occurred on August 21st, and also Elul 1, just as World War I got underway. It also went directly over where ancient Nineveh was. Every empire the path of totality touched met its demise as a result of World War I, including the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman empires. Also, where this eclipse peaked is coincidentally the site of the only battle said to have been any importance on the outcome and result of the war. Early in the war, had the Germans fared a little worse or a little better in defeating the Russians at this Battle of Tannenberg, the outcome of World War I would have been entirely different. Deuteronomy 19:15 describes how, quote, 2 or 3 witnesses are required to confirm a matter and establish a charge, quote. The 3 major hurricanes to wreak havoc on America directly following the eclipse confirmed this sign of impending judgment. The path of totality of the Great American Eclipse ended in the middle of the Atlantic and made a direct bullseye on Hurricane Harvey. The eye wall of Harvey landed in Corpus Christi, which means Body or Church of Christ, Texas, 4 days later and was the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history. The eclipse occurring on the 21st and Harvey landing on the 25th points to Luke 21:25, quote, and there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations, in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, quote. This was only a partial fulfillment of Luke 21:25, as Harvey pointing to this verse is in itself a sign pointing to greater calamity to come involving, quote, the roaring of the sea and the waves, quote. Then Hurricane Irma, the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic, pummeled the entire Florida peninsula. Then, unprecedented destruction came to Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria in what was classified not as a disaster, but rather a catastrophe. Maria busted a major dam a couple days before the Revelation 12 sign, which depicts a birth, and therefore the dam breaking symbolized the woman's water breaking before birth. Hurricane Jose, or Joseph, was said to have affected Hurricane Maria, or Mary, prior to this water breaking that symbolizes a birth. There were more witnesses to this sign of impending judgment than hurricanes. More superlative events hit the U.S. after the eclipse. Besides the costliest and strongest hurricanes, there was the official deadliest and costliest wildfires in history, the worst mass shooting in history, and the worst mass shooting in a church in history. Incidentally, the worst mass shooting prior to Las Vegas was in 2015 in an Orlando gay nightclub on the day of Pentecost. Pentecost means 50, as it was when Moses came down Mount Sinai after 50 days to find the Jews in open hedonistic rebellion. 50 people died in this shooting. Before the Revelation 12 sign and the Great American Eclipse / sign of Jonah, there was another massive sign on July 17th. In the book of Daniel, chapter 9, Archangel Gabriel explains to Daniel that there are 70 sets of 7 years to come for the Jews and their expected Messiah. He described how after 69 sets of 7 years, from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and its walls, would be the arrival of the Messiah. The decree was recorded later in the book of Nehemiah chapter 2 as being the first day in the Jewish calendar in the year 445 BC, and this is confirmed by the Royal British Observatory as being March 14th, 445 BC. The details are in my video number 2. 69 times 7 years equals 483 years. All ancient cultures use 360-day calendars, as does the Bible, including another prophecy. So 483 years times 360 days equals 173,880 days. March 14th, 445 BC plus 173,880 days equals April 6, 32 AD, the day of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem as king on what is known as Palm Sunday. Jesus was crucified on the Passover in 32 AD, and April 6th is confirmed by the Royal British Observatory as being the Sunday before Passover. This prophecy speaks of the Messiah being killed and then afterward a period of, quote, desolations, quote, before the prophecy's resumption with the final set of 7 years. The 70th set of 7 years, for which Israel was restored in the 20th century, is the end times period. What is amazing also is that the 69 sets of 7 years until the arrival of the Messiah in Daniel chapter 9 is actually broken into 62 sets of 7 years and 7 sets of 7 years. We find an amazing parallel to this in history when, in 1535, Suleiman the Magnificent decreed that Jerusalem and its walls be rebuilt. 62 sets of 7 years later, on April 1st, 1969, the Knesset in Israel officially voted to rebuild Old Jerusalem and created the JQDC to oversee this. The other 7 sets of 7 years from this date in 1969 couldn't be more astonishing. 7 sets of 7 years, or 49, times 360 days, brings us exactly to July 17th, 2017, the very day that for one day only, in the aftermath of terrorism on the Temple Mount, the Jews were openly walking around and praying on the Temple Mount, for the first time in 50 years since Jews briefly controlled the Temple Mount in 1967. Thus, we have 62 sets of 7 years from Suleiman the Magnificent to the decree in 1969, and then 7 sets of 7 years to 2017, for a total of 69 sets of 7 years. Therefore, the remaining 70th set of 7 years, the end times period, begins this year. Very briefly, a blood moon's tetrad is 4 total lunar eclipses in a row that all occur on Jewish feast days in the spring and autumn in a 2-year period and have no lunar eclipses in between them. The last 4 blood moons tetrads have coincided with war or calamity for Jewish people, including the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, what had been their main homeland for 1,000 years, the rebirth of Israel in 1948, and the capture of their ancient capital Jerusalem in 1967. As I will show, the significance of the blood moons tetrad of 2014-2015 is equally stunning. Last on my list of signs to summarize briefly are the Jupiter-Venus conjunctions of 2015, 2016, and 2017. It is believed by many, myself included, that the Jupiter-Venus conjunctions in 2 BC was part of what was the Star of Bethlehem that the Magi recognized. Again, the fascinating details of the Star of Bethlehem are in my video number 5. In 2015, the mainstream media was excited about the Jupiter-Venus conjunction on July 1st and was touting it as the closest and brightest in 2,000 years since the, quote, Star of Bethlehem, quote. 3 Jupiter-Venus conjunctions have occurred in the last 3 years that are in the league of the conjunction in 2 BC. The degree of separation of these planets' conjunctions in 2015, 2016, and 2017 are 0.3, 0.03, and 0.3 degrees respectively. It will be many more years before another conjunction as close and bright. Now that we have these recent signs briefly summarized and this background information explained, let's look at what is the most shocking information you have ever learned. Our God is a mathematical God. He uses numbers to reveal himself, and the Bible and the world around us are replete with numbers that unmistakably point to him. This is certainly the case with these signs in relation to each other, and as you will see, no one but our Creator could have procured such perfection. Numbers are objective, not subjective. There is no misinterpreting the language of numbers, which is a reason God uses them. Okay, let's examine this illustration, but please focus precisely on what I'm saying as we go through it and avoid being distracted with other things in this diagram. The diagrams in this video are courtesy of watchfortheday.org. I highly recommend this website. Okay, first, in this timeline, we have the Revelation 12 sign on September 23rd, 2017. The astounding celestial alignment described in verse 1 and 2 was fulfilled on this day. Again, this is the rapture sign, and it is the birth of the church into heaven, and is depicted in the sign as a woman in labor and then giving birth. Here is the Jupiter-Venus conjunction on November 13th that depicts verse 5 of Revelation 12 when the child is, quote, caught up, quote, to heaven. In the Revelation 12 sign, Jupiter symbolizes the church. In the book of Revelation, Jesus says he is the morning star and also described the rapture as giving the church the morning star. The morning star is Venus, and so Venus symbolizes Christ. The Bible also describes the rapture as when Jesus meets his church in the sky. So this joining of Venus with Jupiter is verse 5 symbolically fulfilled. So September 23rd is the start of the Revelation 12 sign, and the Jupiter-Venus conjunction is the completion of the Revelation 12 sign. Okay, let's start from the first blood moon of the blood moon's tetrad on April 15th, 2014, which is not shown in this diagram. It is 1260 days from this day to the Revelation 12 sign. 1260 is a highly significant number and is mentioned 7 times in prophecy as being the length of time of the Antichrist kingdom in the end times. From the last blood moon on September 28, 2015, it is 726 days to the Revelation 12 sign. This is also not depicted in this diagram. 726 is the number for the word harpazo in Strong's Concordance, the universally used reference for the original Koine Greek in the New Testament. Harpazo is the word for rapture used in verse 5 of Revelation 12. So from the last blood moon, the number for the word for rapture in the original Greek points to the rapture sign. Then, it is 777 days from the last blood moon to the Jupiter-Venus conjunction on November 13th, which is the completion of the Revelation 12 rapture sign. The number 7 is the number showing the touch of God upon something and the number of completion. So the last blood moon not only points to the rapture sign on September 23rd, but it also points to the completion of the rapture sign on November 13th. It turns out that the second blood moon in this tetrad also has what looks to be a divine relationship. It isn't shown in this diagram either, but it is 1,131 days from it until the Jupiter-Venus conjunction and completion of the Revelation 12 rapture sign. 1,131 is 360 times pi. 360 is the number of days in a biblical calendar year, and 1,131 days, subtract 777, is 354 days, which is the length of a lunar year. 360 is the number of degrees in a circle, and the number for pi is not only the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its radius, but it is also a mysterious number that shows up in mathematics in ways unrelated to a circle and is found throughout creation. As we will now see, in December, God chose to clearly and unmistakably single out for us the 8th day and symbolic last day of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. This 8th day of Hanukkah began at sunset on December 19th and went until sunset December 20th, 2017. A few hours later was the historic and massively prophetic UN vote on Jerusalem. Just as God has clearly pointed to November 13th and the Jupiter-Venus conjunction, which symbolizes verse 5 of the Revelation 12 sign, God has also clearly and undeniably pointed to this day of December 20th and 8th day of Hanukkah and the UN vote. It is amazing, and I will explain this, but first, allow me to briefly explain the enormous and prophetic significance of this day. Once again, your patience will be highly rewarded. A rudimentary understanding of the Bible and Bible prophecy informs us that the nation of Israel will be restored again at the closing of the age. The Hebrews were brought out of Egypt to the Promised Land in the middle of the 15th century BC. To learn more about the archaeological proof of this, watch the award-winning documentary Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, or go to the additional resources section of my website. Then the Jews were exiled to Babylon for 70 years, and then restored to Israel again in the 6th century BC. Prophecy tells us that the current-day restoration of the Jews to the land of Israel that began in the late 19th century is the second and final restoration. The Bible is a history book. No other world religion is tied to history like Judaism and Christianity. Either the events described in the Bible happened or they didn't. Other world religions are dependent on one man's vision or dream, like that of Muhammad's in the cave or Buddha's under the Bodhi tree. Their visions could have occurred in any other time in history, and it would have made no difference to the religion. This is not the case with biblical Christianity, as this faith is interwoven into the fabric of history. God chose a relatively meek people, geographically at the crossroads of the ancient world, to begin his progressive divine self-revelation to the world. This divine self-revelation will climax with full divine self-revelation when God, manifested as Jesus Christ, takes his throne in Jerusalem at the dawning of the new millennium, the Messianic age, 7 years from now. Other than the Jews, no other ancient people are still a people. 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy for the sake of God proving himself and proving the Bible is not just another collection of man-made stories and wisdom. Much of this prophetic proof comes through the history of the Jews. This passage speaks to this. Isaiah 44, 6-7. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me, since I appointed an ancient people. Let them declare what is to come and what will happen. The miraculous restoration of Jews from over 100 countries to Israel in the 20th century is the banner, or the biggest of all signs from God, that the end times period is at hand and that Bible prophecy proves the Bible and the God of Israel. Isaiah 11:10-12. In that day, the root of Jesse, which is a messianic reference to Jesus, will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him. His resting place will be glorious. In that day, he will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Zechariah 10:9. Though I scattered them among the nations, yet in far countries they shall remember me, and with their children they shall live and return. Jeremiah 16:14-15. However, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but it will be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north and all of the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their ancestors. More is written about the end times period in the Bible than any other period, including the gospel period in the first century. The myriad of prophecies regarding Israel's final restoration in our present time not only include the restoration of Israel, but specifically the holy city of Jerusalem, and even more specifically the restoration of the temple on the Temple Mount. So it makes sense that God has singled out, and with a number of very clear signs has pointed to, the 8th day of Hanukkah, as the holidays of Hanukkah commemorate the rededication of the ancient temple in Jerusalem after a period of disuse. The 8th day of Hanukkah in 2017 coincided a few hours later with the historic vote at the UN to condemn Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This vote followed President Trump's decision 2 weeks earlier to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel's capital, Jerusalem. Bible prophecy is replete with passages regarding how the world will gang up on Israel and seek to divide and destroy Israel in the end times. Zechariah 12:1-3. The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens, and layeth forth the foundation of the earth, and formeth the spirit of man within him. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Zechariah 11:9. And on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Joel 3:1-3. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land. My video number 1 on my YouTube channel has 4 absolutely astounding modern-day examples of the manifestation of the following verse. You must watch my other 5 videos. However, one example of this, which is very minor in comparison to what is in my video, is how recently on the day the Iranian parliament voted to proclaim Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Palestine, Tehran suffered an earthquake that killed 1 person and was also the day the major anti-government protests in Iran started. Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. The emergency session at the UN, hours after the 8th day of Hanukkah to vote against Jerusalem as Israel's capital, was a vote against God's word and God. These nations are unwittingly falling into God's trap and final judgment. Our God is a God of laws, and because of this formal and official rejection of God in the world court that is the United Nations, God will now formally and officially commence judgment on the world. This judgment will likely begin after a very symbolic 42 days from the UN vote, as I will explain in a minute. Through condemning and persecuting Israel, these nations and the world are playing a role in God's plan to finally reveal to the Jews who their Messiah is when they finally call upon him out of desperation at the end of the 7 years end times period, or, quote, Jacob's hour of trouble, quote, as it's called in the book of Jeremiah. Zechariah 12:10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look upon me, the one that they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. The, quote, mystery of the blindness of the Jews, quote, as Paul described it, is truly a mystery, as it is exceedingly clear from Old Testament prophecy that Jesus is the Messiah. The removal of this mystery of the blindness of the Jews, and the Jews finally recognizing Jesus as their Messiah and God, will bring an end to and fulfill the, quote, times of the Gentiles, quote, and will complete the restoration of Israel, ushering in the messianic age of Jesus' rule of the world from Jerusalem. Zechariah 14:6. Then the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. Now that we've clearly established the historic and prophetic significance of Hanukkah Day 8 and this historic UN vote, let's return to the last blood moon again. It is 7 Gregorian calendar years, which is 2,557 days, divided by pi, from this blood moon until Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote. Again, Hanukkah is a Jewish holiday commemorating the rededication of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem after its destruction and a period of disuse in the 2nd century BC. So it is fitting that Hanukkah Day 8 be an important time marker just prior to the beginning of the end times period and the beginning of the 70th set of 7 years from Daniel chapter 9, when the temple will finally be rebuilt and rededicated by Christ at the end of the 7 years. So the last blood moon not only points to the beginning of the Revelation 12 rapture sign on September 23rd, with a number that means rapture in Greek, and also points to the completion of the Revelation 12 rapture sign on November 13th with the number 777, that means completion. But it also points to the UN vote with a number that is 7 years of days, which as a result of the UN vote, God will now initiate 7 years of judgment on the world, and at the same time will rescue and rapture his people, the faithful followers of Jesus. This is enough evidence for me personally, but of course God is far from finished. I will explain the 7-year timeline in a minute, but this last blood moon is also 3,333 days before the end of the timeline on November 11th, 2024, and it is also 333 days before the brightest of the 3 Jupiter-Venus conjunctions on August 27th, 2016, which had a degree of separation of the planets of an incredible 0.03 degrees. From this Jupiter-Venus conjunction in August of 2016, it is 444 days until the Jupiter-Venus conjunction on November 13th, 2017, which is the completion of the Revelation 12 verse 5 rapture sign. Also, from the 2016 conjunction, it is 777 divided by Phi until Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote. Phi is the golden ratio, a mysterious and intriguing mathematical relationship that is found throughout creation and therefore is a signature of God's. So this conjunction, which was the closest at 0.03 degrees separation, points to the completion of the Revelation 12 verse 5 rapture sign by being in the middle of a 777 day count, and also points to Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote with a 777 day count. Next on the list of the countdown to the end times 7-year period is the day the Jews openly prayed on the Temple Mount for the first time. From this day, it is 120 days until the completion of the Revelation 12 verse 5 rapture sign on November 13th. God gave the number 120 to Noah when he referred to the length of time it would be until the flood. Noah and his family were the only ones that would believe the warning of the impending judgment, as everyone considered them foolish. Them entering the ark symbolizes the rapture and the rescuing of the saints before judgment. The number 120 shows up again as the number of days from the impending judgment sign that was the Great American Eclipse on August 21st until Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote. So we have 120 days until the completed verse 5 of the rapture sign, and also 120 days until the UN vote that leads to God's judgment and the rapture event, as I will explain in a minute. The Great American Eclipse on Elul 1 in the Hebrew calendar was also the 120th year anniversary of the first Zionist conference in 1897 to create a Jewish homeland in Israel, which further confirms this 120 number as a sign. From the day the Jews openly prayed on the Temple Mount for the first time, it is 490 days times pi until Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote. This is absolutely stunning because, as stated earlier, this day of Jews openly praying on the Temple Mount was exactly 49 times 360-day years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 1969, and also 69 sets of 7 years from Suleiman the Magnificent's decree in 1535. All of this speaks to the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 about Jerusalem and 70 sets of 7 years, which is 490 years. So here we have this 490 number pointing to the historic UN vote on Jerusalem and soon the beginning of the 70th set of 7 years from Daniel chapter 9, which concerns 490 years for the Jewish people and the arrival of the Messiah. 483 years being the time until Jesus' first coming, and the remaining 7 years from the beginning of the end times period until the conclusion of this age. Daniel chapter 9 also concerns a rebuilt temple in the remaining set of 7 years, so it is fitting that this 490 number points to Hanukkah Day 8, as Hanukkah is about the rededication of the temple. So in summary so far, we have the start of the Revelation 12 rapture sign on September 23rd, 2017. Then we have the completion of the Revelation 12 verse 5 rapture sign on November 13th, 2017. The word sign in Hebrew means foretelling of something to come. Then we have the Hanukkah Day 8 and UN vote on December 20th. And as I will explain, the signs very strongly indicate the UN vote leads to the rapture and the beginning of the 7 years end times period on March 20th. Let's look at some other very interesting things. This diagram reveals the connections between ends of wars, blood moons, and the ultimate end of war. From the official end of World War I at 11/11 on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, we have 11,101 days until the first blood moon of the 1949 tetrad. This blood moon on April 13th, 1949 was also 333 days after Israel was reborn on May 14th, 1948, and 33 days from the end of the Independence War. From the end of the Independence War until the end of the Six-Day War to recapture Jerusalem on the sixth day, it is 6,666 days. From the first blood moon until the end of the 33-day Hezbollah war in Lebanon in 2006, it is 6,666 days times pi. The day of the end of this war was also the anniversary end of World War II. 6,666 days from this day brings us to the end of the age and the end of all war on the 11th day of the 11th month in 2024, which was symbolized by what was called the War to End All Wars, the Great War, World War I, when it also ended on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11:11 a.m. in 1918. God is poetic. I also find it interesting in this example of his amazing poetry that right as the War to End All Wars began, there was a famous eclipse on the first day of the month of Elul that was a sign of Jonah, judgment sign. And similarly, right before this upcoming 7-year period of war to end all wars, on Elul 1, there was also an eclipse that was a sign of Jonah, judgment sign. Let's take a look now at the super blue blood moon that occurred on January 31st, which was also the day of Tu B'Shavat in the Jewish calendar. The day of Tu B'Shavat in the Jewish calendar is the 15th day of the month of Shavat. This is one of 4 New Year's days in the Jewish calendar, and this one refers to the New Year for trees. It is the season of change and marks the passing of winter into spring. It is celebrated with eating the first fruits of the trees, which is interesting because those that are raptured are said to be God's first fruits in the harvest. Jesus commanded that we be watching closely for the signs of his return, and the book of Ezekiel commands us to be God's watchmen. In fact, this video could be titled, Watching for the Many Signs of the Lord's Return. Tu B'Shavat, or New Year for Trees, is known as the day of, quote, watching for the first fruits of the trees, and therefore spring for trees. The almond tree is a tree in Israel that produces its first nuts at this time, and the word in Hebrew for almond tree is the same word as, quote, watching, quote. This Hebrew word is shakid, and in fact, God uses a very appropriate play on words with this Hebrew word in Jeremiah 1:11-12. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. The Lord said to me, You have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The beginning of the season of signs in 2017 began on Tu B'Shavat, which was February 11th, 2017. This date was also played out with more stunning math from God. From this day of watching for signs for the Lord's return, it was 156 days, or 490 days divided by pi, until the massively prophetic day of July 17th, 2017, when Jews openly prayed on the Temple Mount for one day. After exactly 49 years of 360 days from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 1969. Again, the number 490 is astonishing, as it is the number in Daniel chapter 9 that is about the temple being restored in the last 7 years of the prophecy for 490 years. Also, once again, it was another 490 days divided by pi from this prophetic July 17, 2017 date until Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote. The number 153 is another very significant number in the Bible, as it refers to the harvest of souls for Jesus in John chapter 21. Also, Jesus started his ministry in 29 AD. Jesus plus his 12 disciples make 13 men that started this ministry. 153 times 13 equals 1,989. The year 20 AD plus 1,989 years equals 2018. So it is also quite interesting that from February 11th, 2017, or Tu B'Shavat, it was 153 days until the day of terrorism on the Temple Mount on July 14th, which led to the Jews being able to pray on the Temple Mount on July 17th. And also another 153 days from this day until the first day of Hanukkah on December 13th. This was the day of Turkey's emergency summit of Islamic nations as a result of their rage over Trump's embassy move and symbolic gesture to confirm the truth about Jerusalem being Israel's capital city. So the symmetry here that is pointed to with this number of 153 are the 2 days of Islamic anger at Israel. The day of Tu B'Shavat 2017, on February 11th, the day of watching, began the season of massive signs of the Lord's return in 2017. So it is amazing that God also used undeniable math to point to this day in itself. Recall that there are 3 blood moons tetrads in the last 100 years. One surrounding the rebirth of Israel in 1947 to 1948, another surrounding the Jews' recapture and control of their ancient capital Jerusalem in 1967, and the 2014-2015 tetrad that points to the beginning of the end time 7 years and restored temple on the Temple Mount. It was 501 days from the historic UN partition plan to establish a Jewish and Arab state in Palestine on November 29, 1947, until the first blood moon of the 3 tetrads on April 13, 1949. Incidentally, the Jews accepted this UN partition plan, and the Arabs preferred a war to annihilate the Jews. Even though it made the Jewish state a slim sliver of land on the Mediterranean coast, gave the majority of territory to the Arabs, and in one portion made Israel only a few miles wide. Then, it was 501 days from the last blood moon of the 3 tetrads on September 28, 2015, until Tu B'Shavat on February 11, 2017, which again was the day of watching for and beginning of the season of signs in 2017. So God has provided symmetry here with 501 days before the first blood moon of the trio of blood moons, and also 501 days from the last blood moon of the tetrad trio. It's also interesting that it was 50,001 days from the date the first agricultural settlement was erected by Zionist Jews on November 3, 1878, until the last blood moon. Named Petah Tikva, which means door of hope, this settlement began the fulfillment of the prophecy in the book of Hosea chapter 2 regarding God's desire to restore Israel with agricultural settlements and production. The day of Tu B'Shavat in the Jewish calendar is January 31, 2018. As we will see, this day of, quote, watching, quote, for signs comes shortly before a myriad of truly astounding signs. Make sure you watch this video to its end, as these signs are mind-boggling. It also comes shortly before the beginning of the 7 years end times timeline on February 9th and March 20th. I will explain the paramount significance of this timeline in a minute. This super blue blood moon was also the first blood moon since the prophetic blood moons tetrad in 2014-2015. Like the last blood moon of the tetrad in 2015, this blood moon is a supermoon. It is also the first blue moon blood moon in 152 years. Recall that I pointed out the date at the end of the end times period, that is the day to end all wars, on November 11th, 2024. Here in this diagram, we see this key date at the end of the 1,290 days prophesied in Daniel chapter 12. I will explain more about this timeline in a minute. There is a truly astonishing connection between this upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon and the last blood moon. First, it is amazing that from the last blood moon, it is 700 days until the 120th anniversary of the first Zionist conference on August 29, 2017. Again, the number 120 is highly significant, as it is the number God gave Noah until the flood, and the number 700 is highly significant because the number 7 is used over 500 times in the Bible to show God's touch upon something. Then, from August 29th, it is 490 days divided by pi until the upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon. Here again, this amazing 490 divided by pi calculation shows up. There are 3 astounding signs derived from the golden ratio, also known as the phi ratio, that point to this upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon. First, if you are not familiar with the golden ratio, it is 1.618. Discovered by Leonardo da Vinci, it is a mysterious mathematical relationship that shows up throughout creation. For example, in proportions in the human body, plants, DNA, the solar system, art and architecture, music, population growth, and the stock market. Therefore, the phi ratio is a signature of God's. Theologically, adding unity to nothingness, or 0 to 1, produces the Fibonacci series of numbers, which converges on phi as it moves toward infinity. The golden proportion, or phi ratio, is the only way to divide something, such as a line, so that its parts are in proportion to, or in the image of, the whole. Only by trividing the whole does each piece retain its unique relationship to the whole. Only here do we see 3 that are 2 that are 1. The first verse in the book of John captures the essence of this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John 14:9, Jesus said, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." Here, the human Jesus, the Son of Man, is to the divine Jesus, the Son of God, as the divine Jesus, the Son of God, is to God, the Father or whole. What is amazing is that this phi ratio of 3 in 2 in 1 shows up in the relationship between the blood moons and points to the upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon. The total length of time from the first blood moon of the 2014-2015 tetrad until the last blood moon is 18 months. It is another 29 months until the upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon, for a total of 47 months. 18 months out of 29 months is the phi ratio, as well as 29 months out of 47 months also produces the phi ratio. This golden ratio also shows up in the relationship between the two Revelation 12 rapture signs and the upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon. It is 130 days from the Revelation 12 verses 1 through 2 sign on September 23rd until the Tu B'Shavat blood moon, and it is also 80 days from the Revelation 12 verse 5 sign on November 13th until the Tu B'Shavat blood moon. 80 days in 130 days is the golden ratio. So far, we have three major signs clearly pointing to the upcoming Tu B'Shavat super blood moon this January 31st. First, the last blood moon via the number 700, the 120th First Zionist Conference, and the 490 divided by pi number. Second, the blood moon's tetrad with its phi ratio. Third, the Revelation 12 signs through its phi ratio. This would be the three witnesses required to confirm a matter, as described in Deuteronomy 19:15. Yet another way in which God is clearly pointing to this upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon is by way of the two historic conference gatherings to condemn God's people. Just outside Berlin on January 20th, 1942, senior Nazi government officials gathered at the Wannsee Conference to ensure the cooperation of administrative leaders of various government departments in the implementation of the so-called final solution for the Jewish question. 42 days later, there was a blood moon on March 3rd, and then the genocide. Jesus prophesied that there would be another Holocaust of Jews in Judea and Jerusalem in the 7 years end times period. From December 21st, and the historic UN vote to condemn Jerusalem and Jews' rights to their capital, it is also 42 days until the upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon on January 31st. Also, the year of the Wannsee Conference and its blood moon 42 days later was the year the final solution began in 1942. This parallel of 42 days is also interesting because 42 is the number of weeks that Jupiter circled inside the womb of Virgo in the Revelation 12 sign. 42 weeks is the maximum length of time for a healthy pregnancy. Jupiter symbolizes the church, and Jupiter gestating inside the womb symbolizes the church age. So therefore, this maximum of 42 weeks symbolizes God patiently waiting the maximum amount of time before the rapture and commencing judgment. Thus, this 42 days from the world's massively prophetic vote at the UN to condemn God and his word on Jerusalem until the blood moon also symbolizes God's waiting period before commencing his judgment on the world. Also, the number 6 is the number of man, and as we saw earlier, 666 is the number of the length of man's rule until Messiah's rule. 42 is 6 sets of 7. Additionally, in the Old Testament, the number 42 is used 4 times, and each time it refers to slaughter. This includes the length of time of King Saul's rule, which ended because he would not complete the slaughter God told him to. Also, the length of time of the Antichrist kingdom in the end times, which will slaughter many people, is 42 months. So clearly this number 42 is symbolically meaningful as the number of days between the Wannsee Conference and the blood moon before the Holocaust, and also the number of days from the UN vote until the Tu B'Shavat blood moon and the beginning of judgment and the end times period. A fifth sign God is using to clearly point to this upcoming Tu B'Shavat blood moon is the connection between these supermoons. A supermoon is when the moon is at full moon and also at perigee, which is the point in its orbit that it is closest to Earth. According to NASA, a supermoon occurs on average once every 13 months. At the end of 2016, there were 3 supermoons in a row, which is quite rare. The middle of the 3, on November 13th, 2016, was the closest supermoon to Earth since 1948, making it a, quote, super-duper moon. 1948 is the prophetic year Israel was reborn as a nation, so this coincidence was interesting. In Matthew 24, Jesus said that the generation that saw the fig tree's leaves come forth in the spring would not pass away before his second coming. The fig tree represents Israel, and its leaves coming forth in the spring represents Israel's rebirth in 1948. Psalm 90:10 tells us that a generation is 70 years. 70 years from 1948 is 2018. We have now figured out how God has used this supermoon as a sign. From this supermoon, it is 444 days until the upcoming Tu B'Shavat super blood moon. Recall that it was also 444 days between the 2 Star of Bethlehem Jupiter-Venus conjunctions in 2016 and 2017. The conjunction in 2017 being the Revelation 12 verse 5 sign. So these two 444 day counts create symmetry. 444 days from super duper moon sign to super blood moon sign, and also 444 days from Jupiter-Venus conjunction sign to Jupiter-Venus conjunction sign. I don't have the space to go into details here, but there are a number of reasons why the number 444 is prophetic and refers to the end times. However, one reason God uses the numbers 4, 6, 12, and 29 to communicate the end times period is that each of these numbers is the last or end of a period of time. The 4th week of a month is the last week. The 6th day of creation is the last day of creation. The 12th month of a year is the last month. The 29th day of a lunar month is the last day. However, because Hurricane Harvey was mentioned in this video, I will point out that it was a Category 4 hurricane. It devastated the 4th biggest city in the U.S. with just over 4 feet of water, the historic record for amount of rain from one tropical storm. Also, there is a very interesting passage in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, John 4:35. Do you not say, "There are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest"? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. The January 31st Tu B'Shavat blood moon is just over 4 months from the, quote, great sign, quote, the Revelation 12, September 23rd sign. Quote, lift up your eyes, quote, in context of the, quote, harvest, quote, is a reference to the rapture. The, quote, fields are white, quote, could be an allusion to it being wintertime. January 31st was the 153rd anniversary of the abolition of slavery. This is truly profound, not only because of the number 153. The daily Bible reading in all daily Bibles for January 31st is Exodus 12:14 through 13:16. Amazingly, this reading is all about the anniversary keeping of the day the Hebrew slaves were freed from Egypt. There is precedent for God using an event to point to daily Bible readings. For example, 9/11 clearly pointed to Isaiah 9:11. For more astounding information regarding 9/11, I highly recommend you watch the beginning of my video number 5. It was also discovered recently that December 20th's daily Bible reading couldn't be more relevant and profound. Again, with numerous signs and day counts, God overwhelmingly provided evidence that pointed to this day and the UN's vote to officially and formally condemn God and His Word regarding Jerusalem. The daily Bible reading for December 20th is Haggai 1-2 and Revelation 11, which is about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The rebuilding of the temple in God's capital city is part of His plan in fully restoring Israel in the next 7 years. In Haggai 2, God also declares that, quote, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth and to overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations, quote. These daily Bible readings, coinciding with the significance of the historic emergency vote to condemn God's word on Jerusalem, for which God will now in turn condemn the world, couldn't be more prophetic. In light of President Trump's State of the Union speech just hours before the super blue blood moon, it was very interesting to learn that Trump was born on the very hour of a blood moon. The number 7 is God's number showing His divine touch upon something. There are numerous incidents of the number 7 surrounding Trump. On the night of the super blue blood moon and his speech, Trump was 71 years, 7 months, and 17 days old, which hints at 17/7/17, the day of the massive sign when Jews were able to openly pray on the Temple Mount for the first time. Including the date of his birth, on Inauguration Day, Donald Trump was 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old. During his inauguration speech, and only during his speech, a very light rain fell, which in the Bible is considered a sign of God's blessing. The day Trump was elected, Benjamin Netanyahu had been in office 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. From Trump's birth, it was 700 days until Israel's rebirth on May 14th, 1948, and 1,000 days until Israel won its independence war. On Trump's 77th day in office, while eating dinner with the Chinese president, he launched the missiles into Syria after they used chemical weapons. It seems God is demonstrating that Trump is God's Cyrus. Trump is the 45th president, and in Isaiah 45, God says He will use King Cyrus to disarm the enemies. The midpoint day between the all-important last blood moon of the 2014-2015 tetrad to the super blue blood moon on January 31st is November 29th, 2016. This day is the 69th anniversary of the UN partition plan in 1947. Thus, November 29th, 2016 commenced the 70th year from this day. Again, this proposal by the UN to divide Palestine and create a Jewish state for the first time was accepted by the Jews and rejected by the Arabs that preferred war, even though the proposal gave the majority of useful land to the Arabs. There are 4 remarkable eclipses that clearly delineate the territory of Israel that God promised Abraham in Genesis 15. 2 of these eclipses have occurred in recent history, and 2 will occur in the near future. It is stunning that the midpoint between the first and last eclipse of this series of solar eclipses is November 29th, 2016. God has marked out the true territory of Israel and pointed to the UN's partition plan that is against God's word. Now that we've established this day for, quote, watching, quote, for upcoming signs on January 31st, the day of the super blue blood moon, let's go through some truly astounding signs in recent days. Along the way, we'll be presented the evidence supporting the overwhelming case for March 20th being the day of the rapture. 2 days after Tu B'Shavat was February 2nd. God pointed to this day through astounding day counts. Comet C/2017 E1, otherwise known as the Conception Comet, is a truly amazing sign in the sky that appears to have inseminated Virgo on November 16th, 17th, 2017, a few days before Jupiter entered the womb. If you're interested, I highly recommend watching the video made by the guy that discovered this sign on the YouTube channel named World Breaker. From this date, it is 444 days until February 2nd, which makes this the third of 5 instances of 444 days connecting signs. It is also 400 days from the Conception Comet until the UN vote. Jupiter exited the womb of Virgo on September 9th, 2017, which was 9 months and 23 days after the Conception Comet. This is interesting because the Revelation 12 sign occurred on 9/23. Let's look at another sign that clearly pointed to February 2nd in this diagram. There are many astounding day counts that start from the recapture of East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount on June 7th, 1967, which I cannot get into here. However, this particular connection reveals some extremely interesting things. The 17th day of the month of Heshvan in the Jewish calendar is the anniversary of the beginning of Noah's flood. The 10th day of the month of Heshvan is the anniversary of when Noah and his family entered and sealed the ark, which symbolizes the rapture. The day counts are derived from a very significant day in 1967 when the Jews took control of Jerusalem for the first time since the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. They are also derived from the number 120, which is the number God gave Noah until the flood. You will recall that earlier I explained that in Daniel chapter 9, Gabriel told Daniel that the Messiah would arrive in exactly 69 times 7 years. The 70th set of 7 years is therefore 7 years long, and as I explained earlier, these years are 360 days each. 7 times 360 days is 2,520 days. 2,520 days is the length of the end times period. It is a symbolic 2,520 days from the Japan tsunami until this February 2nd date, as well as an additional 2,520 days from February 2nd until the 20th anniversary of the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the timeline, this day of December 26, 2024 is the end of the prophetic 1,335 days from Daniel chapter 12. In a minute, I will describe the amazing signs that occurred on February 2nd. First, the amazing aspects of this diagram. 1,440 is the number of minutes in a day, which we get from the Babylonians. I don't have time to go over the astounding details involved here, but briefly, the number 6 in the Bible is the number symbolizing man, the number 666 even more so, and is in fact the number of the Antichrist or the false prophet in the book of Revelation. On a side note, this is the passage in Revelation 13:18. Quote, "This calls for wisdom, let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666, quote. The Pope's historic name in Latin, which was written on his scepter and mitre, is Vicarius Filii Dei, and using Roman numerals, the numeric equivalent adds up to 666. If 1,440 days represents a single day because a day has 1,440 minutes, then 14,400 days from June 7th, 1967 to November 8th, 2006, Heshvan 17, would then amount to 10 of these, quote, days, quote. Then the following segment of 1,440 days to October 18th, 2010, Heshvan 10, would be another, quote, day, quote, bringing the total to 11, quote, days, quote. The reason this is very interesting is because in 603 BC, the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, had an astounding prophetic dream that the prophet Daniel interpreted for him. This dream depicted 3 additional kingdoms, Persia, Greece, and Rome, to rule over Israel and Jerusalem after the Babylonian kingdom, until the Messiah's permanent rule over Israel and the Messianic kingdom. From the time of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in 603 BC until the end of the timeline in 2024, it is 666 times 1,440 days, or if you will, 666, quote, days, quote. 666 times 1,440 days is also 959,040 days, which is 2,626 years from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in 603 BC until the end of the timeline in 2024. The 666 number thus represents the length of time of man's rule on earth and what is called the, quote, times of the Gentiles, quote, before the Messiah's rule. So here we have the Japan tsunami and its Fukushima disaster on March 11th, 2011, tying into Nebuchadnezzar's dream with its 4 kingdoms until the end of the age. It is mind-boggling to think that a major event in recent history connects with an ancient prophecy about the times of the Gentiles until the coming Messianic kingdom. As well as providing proof, we are close to the end times with these 2,520 numbers that point to February 2nd. So with these signs that clearly pointed to February 2nd, did anything of significance happen on this day? God did not disappoint. He gave us clear and undeniable signs in the stock market on February 2nd. There is plenty of amazing precedent for God providing signs in the stock market, which I don't have time to get into here. For more information, read my website, www.clearlywritten.net. On February 2nd, the Dow lost 666 points. This is supported by the S&P's intraday low at the bottom of the crash in 2009 when it touched 666 points in value. So God has bookended this epic stock market bubble of all of history with 666 numbers. On February 2nd, the Dow closed at 25,520 points, which not only symbolically resembles 2,520 for the duration of the end times, but also 25,520 days prior to February 2nd was the day of the vernal equinox in 1948. Israel became a nation again in the spring of 1948. Also again, Jesus said his return would be within a generation of the fig tree's leaves coming forth in the spring. The fig tree represents Israel. Israel was reborn in the spring of 1948, and Psalm 90:10 tells us that a generation is 70 years. So 70 years from the spring of 1948 is the spring of 2018. This amazing sign in turn provides proof that the beginning of the end times timeline begins on March 20th through its Noah numbers, 7 days to load the ark, and then 40 more days of rain in the flood. This 7 days to load the ark that points to February 9th is a very key date, as it is the first day of the timeline of the 2,520 days of the end times period. I will explain in a minute the amazing signs that very clearly point to this day of February 9th in a minute. In a minute, I will also explain the timeline and why the end times period also contains a 7 lunar year period, which begins on March 20th. For good measure, God threw in the number 144 as the amount of points lost in the NASDAQ index on February 2nd. This is amazing given the connections made with the number 144 here in this diagram I showed in the last video. Here, 144 days comes prior to the Japan tsunami, which connects to February 2nd. It was also recently discovered that 9/11 connects to the Japan tsunami and February 2nd. This is astounding, as I personally feel that 9/11 kicked off this season of impending judgment signs over the last 17 years. It was 911 days from 9/11, or also a prophetic 42 months, until the Spanish 9/11 train terrorism on March 11th, 2004. From this date, it was 7 years until the Japan tsunami. It was also 144 days from September 11th, 2017 until February 2nd. So God has clearly singled out February 2nd, and the sign he gave us was these numbers in the stock market. From February 2nd, 2018, it is also 2,520 days until December 26, 2024. This is day 1,335 in the timeline. This number of days comes from Daniel chapter 12. This day is also the 20th anniversary of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. So it is astonishing that the Japan tsunami connects with the Indian Ocean tsunami in context of warning of impending judgment on the world through the number 666 in the stock market on February 2nd. Again, 6 is the number of man, and so 666 even more so. And as explained in the last video, 666 is the number associated with the length of time in what is known as the times of the Gentiles, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar's dream until the end of 2024. In other words, it is amazing that Nebuchadnezzar's dream connects with the Japan tsunami through the number 666, and in turn this connects with this sign in the stock market on February 2nd through the number 666. God followed up on these stock market signs on February 2nd with another stock market sign 6 days later. Deuteronomy 19:15 tells us that a second witness is required to confirm a matter, and so God did exactly this by giving us another amazing stock market sign, again through the Dow's closing number. On Thursday, February 15th, the Dow closed at 25,200 points. Again, this rhymes with the length of the end times period, which is 2,520 days, but also 25,200 days prior to February 15th was the 17th day of the second month, February 17th, 1949. This was the first day of Israel's first president, the Zionist champion, Chaim Weizmann. This is amazing. Both of these stock market signs point precisely to the rebirth of Israel. As well, this date also contains the 17th day of the second month. This is very interesting because Noah's flood is recorded in the book of Genesis as occurring on the 17th day of the second month. At the beginning of every hurricane season, there is a list of names in alphabetical order pre-made in order to assign names to hurricanes. The same applies to winter storms. This year, Winter Storm Noah came after Winter Storm Matthew on the list. Winter Storm Noah was officially named on February 17th, the 17th day of the second month. The odds of this, of course, are incalculable. Further supporting this sign on February 17th is that it was a prophetic 444 days after the very prophetic UN vote on November 30th, 2016. Not only was the UN vote meaningful because it condemned Israel's rights to its land, but the vote tally was 153 nations in favor versus 7 nations against. This is highly prophetic, as the number 153 is the mysterious number in the book of John, chapter 21, that refers to the harvest of souls and the church age. As well, 7 is the number of disciples in chapter 21 that hauled in the net full of 153 fish. There are in fact 7 instances of the prophetic 444 days connecting major signs. Again, God uses the number 4, 6, 12, and 29 to communicate end times messages, as they are the last or end numbers in a period of time. In the case of 4, it is the 4th and last week in a month. 444 days connects the closest supermoon since 1948 to the super blue blood moon on Tu B'Shavat. 444 days connects the conception comet to the stock market sign on February 2nd. 444 days connects the brightest and closest Jupiter-Venus conjunction at 0.03 degrees in 2016 to the Revelation 12 verse 5 Jupiter-Venus conjunction sign on November 13th, 2017. As well, 444 days connects the Feast of Trumpets in 2016, which was at the time when world leaders of 70 nations gathered for the funeral of Shimon Peres in Jerusalem. This day connects to Hanukkah Day 8 and the UN vote condemning God's word on Jerusalem on December 20th, 2017. This particular event is a major sign for 2 reasons. Shimon Peres was a leader that symbolized the last of the generation that was a part of the rebirth of Israel in 1948, and Jesus said his return would come before this generation would pass away. 70 nations is astounding, as the number 70 in the book of Genesis is used to illustrate 70 original nations after the flood. It was also 444 days connecting the Great American Eclipse, Sign of Jonah, Judgment Sign, and the major sign on June 3rd, 2016. On June 3rd, 2016, representatives of nations met in Paris to discuss what to do about Israel, in other words, how to take land from Israel, without Israel in attendance and Israel formally rejecting the talks. God let it be known he was displeased with this arrogance. Genesis 12:3 tells us, quote, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." Quote. The very day of the talks was the same day of the peak of the epic once in 200 years destructive flood in Paris. The day before, when Secretary of State John Kerry flew to France for the talks, a Navy Blue Angels jet crashed in Nashville, and a USAF Thunderbirds jet crashed in Colorado. These are ceremonial precision jets, and they are not supposed to ever crash. The Thunderbird jet crashed seconds after flying over Barack Obama's commencement speech, and both jets were a prophetic number 6 in their squads. The Blue Angels jet that crashed right after flying over Obama during his speech embodies the symbolism of a fallen angel. Revelation 12:7-9. This implies a connection with fallen angels and Obama. As I will explain in a minute, this day also connects with what is very clearly the day the Antichrist will be revealed on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 2018, through 666 days. So these jets that are number 6 in their squads, and this 666 connection, is yet one more sign that Obama is one of the 2 beasts in the book of Revelation. This example of nations' involvement in Middle East talks to discuss how to divide Israel that directly correlate with epic judgment signs is one of many that together create a tetrad of epic signs. To learn more, I highly recommend my video number 1 on my channel, clearlywritten.net. 444 days also connects the 120th anniversary of the First Zionist Conference in 1897 and the major sign on June 12, 2016. Again, 120 is the number God gave Noah for the length of time before the flood and judgment. This 120th anniversary was also the day Category 4 Hurricane Harvey left Houston after hovering for 4 days and dropping 4 feet of water on the 4th biggest city in the U.S. June 12, 2016 was the day of Pentecost in the Jewish calendar. Pentecost means 50, and the Feast of Pentecost in the Jewish calendar is celebrated on the 50th day after Passover to commemorate Moses' coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments on the 50th day. When Moses came down, he encountered complete spiritual rebellion among the Hebrews. On the day of Pentecost in 2016, the worst mass shooting in U.S. history at that point occurred at a gay nightclub in Orlando. In the tragedy, 50 people died. Throughout Bible history, the Bible singles out homosexuality as the symbolic sin and key marker of extreme rebellion before God's judgment and wrath. There is an unseen spiritual aspect to everything, and it is no coincidence that the LGBT movement uses the rainbow as their symbol in order to mock God. In the Bible, it is God's symbol of authority and his sign of mercy and covenant in the face of judgment. This is Google's Doodle winner for 2017. The hallmark of the Antichrist's kingdom will be religious pluralism and homosexuality. This doodle reveals the spirit of Antichrist that pervades our culture today. America officially and formally ended its covenant with God on June 26, 2015, when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, and the White House and One World Tower were bathed in rainbow colors. As a result of this, judgment is coming and America will be destroyed. It is a very prophetic 999 days from this day until the beginning of the end times timeline on March 20th, 2018. So here is a total of 7 connections of a prophetic 444 days connecting prophetic signs. 7 is, of course, used over 500 times in the Bible to show God's divine touch upon something. Another noteworthy instance of 444 is that the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979 was 444 days long. Also, from the beginning of the 2,520 days end times timeline on February 9th, which is also a day for, quote, watching, quote, for signs, as I will explain in a minute, it was 777 days backward to the day the hostages received $4.4 million in compensation. The Iranian hostage crisis was a huge deal for America. It was the beginning of the war on terrorism. As I explained in my video number 5, 9/11 was a warning and act of judgment on America. God was pointing to Isaiah 9:11. I highly recommend you watch my video number 5. With these numbers and connections, God is clearly saying that the Iranian hostage crisis was also a warning of impending judgment. The Iranian hostage crisis was also the beginning of the Iran Islamic Republic, America's and Israel's arch-enemy. It's also interesting that 1776, the year America was born, is 4 times 444. It is further interesting that Hebrew letters are also numbers, and the word for Damascus equals 444. The prophecy regarding Damascus pinpoints our current location in the timeline of biblical prophecy. Isaiah 17:1, quote, the oracle concerning Damascus, quote, behold, Damascus is about to be removed from being a city and will become a fallen ruin, quote. It is astounding how this is coming to pass. These images show the apocalyptic condition of much of Damascus. If you watched my last video, you will recall that many signs clearly pointed to February 9th as being a very important date. So what happened? The events that unfolded on this day were very prophetic. First, though, let's quickly go over some of the amazing signs that pointed to this day. February 9th was the 24th day of the month of Shavat in the Jewish calendar. In the book of Zechariah, on the 24th day of the month of Shavat, the prophet receives an end times vision involving a horseman riding a red horse amongst trees, along with 3 other horsemen. As we know, God has overwhelmingly focused our attention to the blood moon that occurred on the day of Tu B'Shavat in the Jewish calendar. Again, this day is the Jewish New Year for trees. So here, God is connecting this passage in Zechariah to Revelation chapter 6 and also to Tu B'Shavat with its reference to trees. This chapter and the following chapter are about God returning his mercy to Israel and restoring Israel. It is also about God's anger at the nations that seek to divide Israel and destroy Israel, and his wrath he will bring to these nations. It is also about how at the conclusion of the end times, the Jews will know Jesus is their Messiah. Zechariah 2:9, quote, then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me, quote. Also in this chapter 1 of Zechariah, the 4 horsemen amongst the trees are sent by God to watch over the whole earth and report to God their findings. Zechariah 1:11, quote, and they reported to the angel of the Lord who was standing amongst the myrtle trees, quote, we have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace, quote. This also makes this 24th day of the month of Shavat a day of, quote, watching, quote, for signs. And as we will see, God has used both Tu B'Shvat and 24 Shvat as very important days in demonstrating his signs. Here are a few amazing signs that confirm this day of February 9th. On November 4th, 2003 was the most powerful solar flare in recorded history. Had it been aimed at Earth, it would have been disastrous. As we can see in this diagram, it has two sets of the prophetic 2,520 days from this event until the sign of Jonah Great American Eclipse on August 21st, 2017. There was a strong solar flare that occurred several days after the eclipse on September 6th. From this date, it is 490 days divided by pi until February 9th. The last video demonstrated how this number of 490 divided by pi is truly an amazing number and how God used it a few times last year in his signs. The midpoint of the 2014-2015 tetrad on January 5th, 2015 is 1,131 days to February 9th. This is amazing because this number connected the second blood moon of the Revelation 12 verse 5 sign on November 13th. It is also 360 times pi. 360 is the number of days in a Bible year, and both are mathematics numbers related to a circle. As well, 1,131 minus 777 is 354, which is the length of a lunar year. Also, at 0.03 degrees separation, the closest and brightest of the Star of Bethlehem Jupiter-Venus conjunctions on August 27, 2016 is 531 days until February 9th. Again, 531 days is the number of days between the first blood moon and the last blood moon. It was discovered just prior to February 9th that God was revealing not only this date of February 9th, but also a precise 11-hour window of time. Stunningly, this window of time pointed precisely to the hour of the prophetic events that unfolded. It was just after midnight on the morning of the 10th, Israel time, that Israel shot down an Iranian drone that had entered Israel airspace. Israeli jets then struck the location the drone was sent from. In the process, an Israeli F-16 was shot down. Israel then commenced its largest airstrike on Syria since 1982. This ambush by Iran and Syria also involved Russia. This major event is the first direct conflict between Iran and Israel and marks a major escalation to war, a war in the end times that is prophesied in the book of Ezekiel chapter 38 and Psalm 83. Psalm 83, 4-5. They have said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are a confederate against thee." This diagram here shows how God revealed the precise timing of this event. In this diagram here, we see how the close Jupiter-Mars conjunction on January 7th, 2018 was 813 days from the Jupiter-Mars conjunction in the constellation Leo on October 17th, 2015. Jupiter is the Messiah planet, and Leo is the Messiah constellation. In Genesis, the Messiah is said to be like a lion, and the Messiah is also said to come from the tribe of Judah, which Leo represents. Mars, the red planet, symbolizes war. From the conjunction on January 7th, it is 2,554 days until the end of the end times timeline. This timeline I will explain clearly in a minute. 2,554 divided by pi is 813 days. Here we can see that God has provided precedent for this calculation by providing two other examples of conjunctions pointing to the end in 2024 through this 7-year period divided by pi that connects the sign. In this diagram, again, we can see this 813 days interval between the two Jupiter-Mars conjunctions. Again, this 813 number is 2,554 divided by pi, and 2,554 is the number of days from the January 7th conjunction until the end of the end times. Also, from February 9th, the day of the prophetic war event and beginning of the 7-year end times timeline, it is 2,520 days to the end. This all becomes absolutely astounding when we introduce the Revelation 12 sign on September 23rd. From the beginning of the Revelation 12 sign, 1 hour after sunset in Israel on September 22nd, it is 2,554 hours to the January 7th conjunction. 1 hour before sunrise on September 24th and the completion of the Revelation 12 sign, it is 2,520 hours until the January 7th conjunction. So this is quite interesting, given that these numbers also connect to the end of the end times. When we take these two numbers and divide them by pi, we get 813 hours and 802 hours. 813 hours and 802 hours from the January 7th conjunction with Mars gives us a window of time between 3:37 p.m. on the 9th and 2:37 a.m. on the 10th, Israel time. In other words, the conjunction on the 7th between Jupiter and Mars, the planets of the Messiah and war, pointed to the precise time of this major escalation to war in the Middle East. Adding to this event that is part of God's process of restoring to Israel, it is also interesting that this 2,554 number is the number of years back from 2018 to 537 BC, the year the Jews returned from their captivity in Babylon and Israel was restored. Let's quickly cover one more topic before explaining the end times timeline and the overwhelming and indescribable stunning proof for its beginning being on November 20th, 2018. Here we have what could be called a tetrad of earthquakes. For those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, as Jesus said, there are amazing patterns contained within this that clearly reveal a designer to our world that has complete sovereign control over everything. In any given year, there are usually 10 to 20 7.0 or higher earthquakes around the world, or roughly one every 3.5 weeks. On January 10th this year, a 7.6 earthquake hit off the coast of Honduras. This occurred 177 days after a 7.7 earthquake hit off the coast of Russia on July 17, 2017. This again was the massively prophetic day the Jews were able to openly pray on the Temple Mount for the first time. 177 days before this day, another 7.9 earthquake hit Papua New Guinea, and this too was 177 days after a 7.7 earthquake hit in the Marianas. The number of 177 days is very interesting, given this is the number of days that separated the blood moons in the tetrad. Yet this pattern of 7.0 earthquakes paralleling the blood moons does not occur randomly in time. It zeroes in on the prophetic July 17th day. Within this date itself, 7-17-17, we find 7s and 1s, which hint at the number 177. Yet perhaps even more interesting is the pattern between the number of days between the first and last blood moons and the first and last earthquakes, and the number of days between the blood moons tetrad and the earthquakes tetrad. The number of days between tetrads is 306, which divided by 2 is a prophetic 153. Again, 153 is the number given in John 21, symbolizing the harvest of souls in the church age. And the number 153 is hinted at with the duration of 531 days of the tetrads. The number 531 is in itself a meaningful number, as it is the number of years from the second blood moon in the tetrad that surrounds the enormous calamity and expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, which had been their main homeland for over 1,000 years, until the end of the 7 years end times timeline in 2024. From this Spanish expulsion tetrad, there isn't another tetrad until the trio of tetrads that began with the rebirth of Israel in 1948. Chronologically, this particular blood moon connection from 1493 is the first blood moon out of the 16 blood moons in the 4 tetrads to have a connection to anything. So because this first connection is pointing to the end in 2024, this is more symbolic proof of the timeline that begins February 2nd. The last earthquake and the end of the earthquake's tetrad on January 10th also splits evenly the symbolically meaningful 42 days from the UN vote until the Tu B'Shavat blood moon, giving us 21 days, which is 3 sevens, or God's signature 777. 7 days after this earthquake, on January 17th, an unexpected skirmish broke out between 42 Jews and police on the Temple Mount after these 42 Jews began to openly pray after being provoked by Muslims. Jews are not allowed to pray at all on the Temple Mount. This second instance of Jews praying on the Temple Mount comes 7 plus 7 days before the Tu B'Shavat blood moon, and further confirms this symbolism of 42 days from the UN vote until the Tu B'Shavat blood moon. Also, it's interesting how the Jewish press news outlet unknowingly titled this article with the word watch. We know from prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 that the end times timeline is 7 times 360 days, which is 2,520 days. We can also be 100% confident that God has revealed that the end times timeline ends in the autumn and winter of 2024. God has revealed this proof in many ways through signs and day counts that cannot be a coincidence, including the connections in the end of wars, blood moons, and the end diagram that I explained earlier. The odds that these myriad connections are a coincidence is what statisticians call, quote, absurd, quote, and unworthy of calculating. Therefore, this is the timeline. First, let's quickly go over one of these proofs of the timeline. Jesus spoke of an event that would occur at the beginning of the last half of the end times. He also referenced how Daniel the prophet recorded this event in the book of Daniel. This is the day the Antichrist sets up on the Temple Mount what is called the abomination that causes desolation. Here we can see that this very important day is May 2nd, 2021. This day is the 20th day of the month of Iyar in the Jewish calendar. It is the day the Jews set off into the wilderness in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. This parallels Revelation 12 and Matthew 24, where we are told the Jews will flee Jerusalem into the wilderness at the time of the abomination that causes desolation event. Let's quickly look at an amazing proof that this day of May 2nd, 2021 is the day of the abomination that causes desolation. This proof of May 2nd, 2021 as the day of the abomination that causes desolation is in itself also a proof of this end times timeline. It is derived from the connections between the 2014 and 2015 blood moons tetrad and the prophetic day of terrorism on the Temple Mount on July 14th, 2017. As I mentioned, from the first blood moon on April 15th, 2014 to the Tu B'Shavat super blood moon on January 31st, it is 47 months. This 47 months was shown to be highly significant due to its connection in the phi ratio between the blood moon's tetrad and the January 31st blood moon. On July 14, 2017, terrorism took place on the Temple Mount, which led to the prophetic fulfillment of Jews worshiping on the Temple Mount for one day on July 17, 2017. For reasons I will explain in a minute, the end times timeline that ends in the autumn of 2024 reveals that May 2, 2021 is the day of the profoundly important prophetic event on the Temple Mount known as the abomination that causes desolation. This day is the 20th day of the month of Iyar in the Jewish calendar. This can't be a coincidence, because Iyar 20 is the anniversary day that the Jews at Mount Sinai, after coming out of Egypt, began their journey into the wilderness. Prophecy tells us that on this upcoming day of the abomination that causes desolation, a remnant of Jews that believe Jesus is the Messiah will flee for their lives from Jerusalem into the desert wilderness. If this May 2nd, 2021 is the day of the abomination that causes desolation, then 47 lunar months prior to this date is July 14th, 2017. This is stunning confirmation of the timeline that begins on February 2nd, as the terrorism on the Temple Mount on July 14th, 2017, which led to prophecy fulfillment 3 days later, connects to the terrorism and the abomination on the Temple Mount. This connection is made through the highly significant number of 47 months that also connects the blood moons through a phi ratio clearly designed by God. In other words, 47 months connects blood moon to blood moon, and also 47 months connect terrorism event to the terrorism event. Here we can see in this diagram that the very prophetic 1,260 days rule of the Antichrist kingdom starts on the day of the abomination that causes desolation and goes until the Day of Atonement, the most important day in the Jewish calendar. This Day of Atonement is October 12, 2024. This is when Christ will return to Israel in full glory. With him will be his faithful servants, all those that are in heaven prior to this day. We can see here that the day to end all wars, as explained earlier in the End of Wars, Blood Moons, and the End diagram, is November 11th, 2024, the symbolic anniversary of the end of the war to end all wars, World War I. This is the last day of the prophetic 1,290 days given in the book of Daniel, chapter 12. Again, here we can see that December 26, 2024, is the end of the 1,335 days given in the book of Daniel, chapter 12. This is the first day of Hanukkah that will begin the rededication of the temple, where Jesus will rule from in the millennial kingdom. And this is fitting because Hanukkah is about the rededication of the temple. As mentioned earlier, it is also the 20th anniversary of the Indian Ocean tsunami. The last day of the timeline ends on January 2nd, 2025, which is the last day of Hanukkah, the official beginning of our Lord's rule in the millennial kingdom on earth. Understanding this timeline has been a learning curve. It has progressively come into greater focus with time. The reason we previously thought at the time that the dates of November 19th, December 20th, February 2nd, and February 9th were locks for the rapture and beginning of the end times is because at the time we thought the timeline fit these dates. Before November 19th, we thought the timeline started on this day and ended at the end of the 1,260 days on October 12th, 2024. Then we thought the timeline ended at the end of the 1,290 days and therefore started on December 20th. Adding to this were the myriad of signs God was using to point to this day. God did not disappoint in confirming the signs with the massively prophetic UN vote condemning Jerusalem and God's word. However, we were incorrect about the timeline's start date. The same applies to February 2nd and February 9th. Before these dates, we thought the timeline ended at the beginning of Hanukkah in 2024, and then we thought it ended at the end of Hanukkah in 2024. Adding to this were the myriad of signs God was using to point to these dates of February 2nd and February 9th. Again, God did not disappoint in confirming these signs. However, we were incorrect about the timeline's start date, and therefore the timing of the rapture and the beginning of the end times. To be clear though, throughout this evolution of understanding regarding the timing of the timeline, what has never changed is the date of the abomination that causes desolation on May 2nd, 2021, and the other dates at the end of their prophetic day counts in 2024 from the date of the abomination that causes desolation. This is because these dates are confirmed through prophetic events, signs, and day counts that cannot be a coincidence. It is only the shifting of the timeline period that has changed. The timeline cannot shift anymore into the future without invalidating these other confirmed dates. This is one reason we can be supremely confident that March 20th is the date of the rapture and the beginning of the end times. We now also have an avalanche of absolutely stunning signs that confirm this date of March 20th, as I will explain. The quality and volume of signs is much higher for this date than any of the previous dates that God did confirm with prophetic events on the dates. After February 2nd, we realized the timeline did not end at the beginning of Hanukkah 2024, but rather at the end of Hanukkah 2024, which in retrospect makes more sense. In fact, in general, we can now in retrospect see that this is where the end of the timeline should be, not because we are trying to make it fit, but rather because this is appropriate. There is a mysterious prophecy passage in Matthew 24 that has left theologians over the ages scratching their heads as to its meaning. Jesus said in verse 22, quote, "If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened," quote. We now believe we finally know what he meant. The 2,520 days end times period began on February 9th and ends on January 2nd, 2025. As I will explain in a minute, February 9th had truly stunning signs pointing to it, and very prophetic events unfolded on this date. However, the rapture did not occur, and neither did the end times. This is because God has decided to use 7 lunar years of 354 days for the end times period instead of 7 360-day years. In effect, he has cut the days short. Through the signs and connections in this diagram, God has undeniably revealed and proved this theory for us. Earlier I showed how God connected the second blood moon and the Revelation 12 verse 5 sign with 1,131 days. I explained the wonder of this number, as it is 360 times pi. Both of these are numbers of a circle. It was also shown that 777 subtracted from this 1,131 number is 354, which is the number of days in a lunar year. This is absolutely amazing in itself. What are the odds that two numbers of a circle multiplied together would equal God's number 777 and the length of a lunar year? So this 1,131 number is truly an awe-inspiring and extremely special number. It is now crystal clear that God has used this number to prove to us that he is using 7 lunar years for Daniel's 70th week and the end times timeline. To confirm to us that God is using a 7 lunar year timeline, God has pointed to the beginning of both the 2,520-day timeline and the beginning of the 2,480-day timeline with this 1,131 number that has the lunar year embedded in it. We can see this in this diagram, what I believe is the most beautiful diagram ever created. Not only has God pointed at both timelines with a number that has embedded in it his number, 777, and the lunar year number, 354, but what is also amazing to behold is the manner in which he has done this. First, God has pointed to the 7 times 360-day end times timeline with a 1,131 day count that uses the entirety of the very important 2014-2015 blood moons tetrad through its midpoint date. This is from January 5th, 2015 to February 9th, 2018. Again, February 9th, 2018 is also 24 Shevat in the Jewish calendar, which is a day for watching for signs. Not only this, but God has stunningly aligned this 1,131 day count to break into 777 and 354 days at the day of watching for signs on 24 Shevat 2017, which is February 20th, 2017. This is then paralleled with God also pointing to the beginning of the 7 times 354 day end times timeline on March 20th, 2018, with 1,131 days starting at another important day of watching for signs on 24 Shevat 2015, which was February 13th, 2015. Astonishingly, God has also broken up this 1,131 days at the 4th of 4 prophetic 24 Shevat days of watching for signs, February 3rd, 2016. It is a lunar year from 24 Shevat 2015 to 24 Shevat 2016, and then 777 days to March 20th, 2018. God has used all 4 of the 24 Shevat days of watching for signs in a symmetrical way in his beautiful confirmation of the 7 lunar year timeline. God completes this parallel by connecting the 24 Shevat 2015 to 2 blood moons that don't have any other connections to them, meaning they were saved for this purpose. In doing so, he supports this 24 Shevat 2015, as these are the only other connections to this 24 Shevat. It is 50 days to the 3rd blood moon in the tetrad, and a very prophetic 1,260 days to the upcoming blood moon on July 27th, 2018. In summary, God has made it crystal clear for those with eyes to see that he's using a 7 times 354 day 70th week, or end times timeline. Let's look at another very beautiful diagram that clearly reveals that March 20th is the day of release from captivity for the faithful followers of Christ. First, on January 15th, 2017, leaders from 70 nations gathered in Paris to discuss dividing Israel. This was again without Israel and Israel formally condemning the conference. This was prophetic, as the number 70 is associated with the number of original nations after the flood in the book of Genesis. What is extremely fascinating is the parallel with the gathering of 70 leaders from 70 nations in Jerusalem for the funeral of Shimon Peres on September 30th, 2016. This was exactly 3.5 months prior to the gathering of 70 nations in Paris. 3.5 months rhymes with 3.5 years of wrath that is prophesied for the nations in the book of Revelation. It also can't be a coincidence that the name Perez rhymes with Paris, and that Perez in Hebrew means to divide. 70 nations gathered in Paris to arrogantly discuss how to divide Israel, after 70 nations gathered in Israel to pay respect to Perez. From the day 70 nations gathered to divide Israel, it is 430 days to the beginning of the end times on March 20th, 2018. The number 430 is highly significant. It is the number of years the Hebrews were in captivity in Egypt, and it is the number of years that God told the prophet Ezekiel the Jews would be punished. God told Ezekiel this before the Jews were taken into captivity by the Babylonians. As I explained earlier, the Jews paid 70 years of this punishment in Babylon, leaving 360 years left. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 26, God told the Jews their punishment would be multiplied by 7 if they did not repent and change. 360 years times 7 is 2,520 years. 2,520 years times 360-day years, the length of a year in the Bible, is 907,200 days. 907,200 days is 2,438.8 solar years. The Jews returned to Babylon in the autumn of 537 BC. 536.4 BC, which equals the autumn of 537 BC, plus 2,438.8 years equals 1948.4. Israel was reborn in the spring of 1948. So 430 days from this sign on January 15th, 2017 is March 20th, 2018. This number of 430 symbolizes the release from captivity of the faithful followers of Jesus on March 20th, 2018. In other words, this symbolizes the rapture. At the same time, the 70 nations in these signs also symbolizes the beginning of judgment on the nations in conjunction with the time of the rapture. God provided a second witness for this using the other 70 nations sign on September 30th, 2016. From this day, it is a highly symbolic 537 days until March 20th, 2018. This is the year the Jews were released from captivity by the Babylonians. It is amazing that the numbers of 430 and 537 are used in this story God is telling. God is clearly demonstrating that March 20th is the day of the release from captivity and the rapture, while at the same time demonstrating it is the beginning of the end times for the nations. Let's take a look at this very intense diagram. After this diagram, I will explain a diagram that I think is the climax discovery and revelation concerning the timing of our Lord. As you can see, this diagram titled Countdown to the Vernal Equinox displays an overwhelming number of astounding connections of signs with this vernal equinox on March 20th, 2018. From first glance, we can see that God is clearly communicating the significance of this day. The other dates he pointed to, such as December 20th, 2017 or February 9th, do not at all compare with the level of confirmation he has revealed regarding this day. Let's begin going through some of the connections and their signs. First, we have the vernal equinox of 1948. Israel was reborn in the spring of 1948. Jesus said he would return within a generation of the fig tree bringing forth its leaves in the spring. Scripture tells us that a generation is 70 years and that the fig tree represents Israel. Israel was reborn in the spring of 1948, 70 years ago. The vernal equinox date was revealed through the sign on February 2nd when the Dow lost 666 points and closed at 25,520. 25,520 days back was the vernal equinox of 1948. From this February 2nd stock market sign, it is 7 days to the February 9th prophetic event of the Israeli F-16 jet crash. From this day, it is another 40 days to March 20. 7 days and then 40 days symbolize the 7 days to load the ark and then 40 days of rain for the flood. Next, Pastor David Wilkerson died on April 27, 2011. This is a prophetic and symbolic 2,520 days before March 20th. 2,520 days is the length of the end times period. David Wilkerson was well known for sounding the alarm that judgment on America is coming soon, as he saw the nation's rebellion rise dramatically over his lifetime. The prophetic day David Wilkerson died was the day of the worst tornado outbreak in U.S. history. There were 207 tornadoes across the Deep South on this day, and 4 of them were in the extreme category EF5. April 27, 2011 was also the day the Obama White House finally released a digital copy of his birth certificate to the public in response to the demands of Donald Trump. 1 year later, Sheriff Arpaio of Phoenix, Arizona, officially had an investigation conducted into its authenticity. 2 independent digital forensic teams in Europe concluded it was an obvious digital forgery that did not have a paper origin. That this certificate was released on this prophetic day, 2,520 days before the beginning of the end times, is not only a sign that this is the biggest fraud in history, but it is one more sign that Obama is the second beast in the book of Revelation. Next, it is a very prophetic and symbolic 1,260 days from the second blood moon until March 20. 1,260 days is the length of time of the Antichrist kingdom in the latter half of the end times period. Next, from the midpoint day of the 2014-2015 blood moon's tetrad on January 5, 2015, it is 1,131 days to February 9, 2018, which as we have seen is the beginning of the 2,520 days 7 years timeline. And then, from February 9th, it is another 40 days to March 20. 40 days was the number of days of rain when the flood came in the book of Genesis. Next is the very prophetic eclipse in 2015. On the vernal equinox in 2015, a solar eclipse occurred at precisely the hour when day and night are evenly split on the globe. This solar eclipse also occurred in between the second and third blood moon eclipses, thereby splitting the tetrad. Additionally, occurring on Nisan 1 in the Jewish calendar, this eclipse precisely split the Jewish calendar year. What is also uncanny is the path of totality this eclipse drew on the map. It precisely split the New World and the Old World. Many believe, myself included, that this prophetic splitting of the New World and Old World on the map symbolizes the transferring of the global center of power from America back to Europe, specifically Rome, the seat of the Antichrist, the Pope, in the end times. Also, what is uncanny is that the time of the exact peak of the eclipse coincides with what is arguably the center point or point of greatest splitting on its path of totality that split the New World and Old World. This eclipse is exactly 3 solar years back from March 20th. The eclipse occurred in the constellation of Pisces, and the Great American Eclipse, that was the sign of Jonah judgment sign, occurred in the constellation of Leo. These constellations are separated by 153 degrees. Again, 153 is the number from John 21 that symbolizes the harvest of souls at the end of the church age. Next, from the day America officially and formally severed its covenant relationship with God on June 26, 2015, it is 999 days to March 20th. This is the day the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage and the White House and One World Tower were bathed in rainbow colors, thereby mocking God's sign of covenant at the 2 points of highest symbolic national prestige, at the very location of the judgment sign that was 9/11. 9 is the number signifying judgment, and this sign is 3 nines. Next, from the day of the very beautiful and unique sign that was the Conception Comet on November 16, 2016, it is a very symbolic 490 days to March 20. Again, the number 490 is the number from Daniel chapter 9 that speaks of the length of the end times period and the arrival of the Messiah. 490 days divided by pi back in time from the Conception Comet reaches Pentecost 2016. This was when 50 people died at a location of open spiritual rebellion, a gay nightclub, on the day that means 50 in the Jewish calendar. It was the worst mass shooting in U.S. history at that point. As discussed in the last diagram, it is 537 days and 430 days from the gatherings of 70 nations until March 20. The Great American Eclipse, that was the sign of Jonah judgment sign, on August 21, 2017, occurred in the constellation of Leo. The vernal equinox on March 20 will be in the constellation of Pisces. These two constellations are separated from each other by 153 degrees in the sky. Again, 153 is the number of fish hauled in by the disciples in the book of John chapter 21. This symbolizes the church age and the harvest of souls at the end of this age. Pisces is the constellation with two fish. So then naturally, the net is brought in, the church age ends, the Revelation 12 sign is fulfilled, and the rapture occurs in the constellation of Pisces. The Revelation 12 sign at the autumnal equinox, at its beginning on September 22nd, comes half circle from equinox to March 20. As well, from the sign's end on September 24th, it is a half lunar year at 177 days. The period of 177 days has been repeated in the blood moons tetrad and earthquake tetrad. From the end of the earthquake tetrad of 7 magnitude earthquakes spaced at 177 days and hinging off open Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount for the first time on July 17, 2017, or 7/17/17, we have 70 days to March 20. Another ode to the 70 years from 1948 to 2018, and the year the temple last stood in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now let me introduce what is, in my humble opinion, the beautiful climactic discovery in this endeavor for watching for signs for our Lord's return. The elements in this diagram incorporate and summarize the key and most symbolic aspects for the rapture and the beginning of Daniel's 70th week and the end times. Many of us would agree that the Revelation 12 sign is the sign of signs. It is called the, quote, great sign, quote, in the Bible. No other sign in the Bible is called great. It is the rapture sign in the Bible. It would therefore seem appropriate then that the rapture sign point to the actual rapture event. It does, and in a very beautiful and symbolic manner. First, I would like to say that after September 23rd came and went, it was natural for us to look to Scripture and hunt for explanation for why the rapture didn't happen, and try to discover clues for when the rapture would be. It was natural, especially given the time of year in the Jewish calendar, to try and make a date fit Scripture regarding feasts. In retrospect, I think it is very clear at this point that feasts are irrelevant in this. Continuing with trying to fit feast symbolism into a rapture date is akin to repeating the same error and expecting different results. The unfulfilled feasts will occur in rapid succession at the Lord's second coming in the autumn of 2024. Instead, I think it is obvious that the discovery of his timing will come through math and signs. Exactly the way the Magi, Jews from Babylon, were able to discern the timing of the birth of Messiah through the math in Daniel chapter 9 and the signs in the sky. Also, as a result of believing his timing can be known through math and signs, just as it was with the revelation of the timing of his birth to the Magi, I firmly believe that the series of signs and clues are not random. They are not solely for the purpose of letting us know his timing in general. This would be teasing, as he knew we would look for meaning. This is not in our God's character. On the contrary, God has been progressively revealing his exact timing through this trail of signs and clues, so that we can warn others of the exact date and thereby provide powerful evidence for Christ that will hopefully inoculate those left behind from the coming deception. As in the days of Noah and Lot knew the exact timing of the impending judgment. I pray those that are watching this video will tell many others about March 20th. Here in this diagram, it seems very clear that God has revealed the timing of the rapture, and true to his love for poetry, he has used the Revelation 12 sign. As with the Magi, this discovery comes to us through signs and math. The conception comet is not as well known as the Revelation 12 sign. It is the overshadowed, more obscure second witness to the Revelation 12 sign. Yet, they are both alike and also quite different than the other signs. Arguably, blood moons, eclipses, and conjunctions happen. In these cases, we find the patterns and discern the signs. What is unique regarding the Revelation 12 sign and the conception comet is that the alignment itself in the sky is so statistically improbable that it is obvious from this alone that these phenomenon were designed by God. Watch the video made by the brother that discovered this comet on the YouTube channel named World Breaker. The conception comet is such an amazing and beautiful sign from God. This being said, I still believe there is enormous symbolism within the feasts, just that feast dates do not apply to the rapture event date. Through this conception comet, we have a connection with the conception of the church on the day of Pentecost. This was Pentecost 2016. Symbolically, I think Pentecost is extremely appropriate for the rapture. All of the variety of different offerings symbolize those raptured from every tribe and tongue. The priest waving the offerings of firstfruits before the Lord in verse 20 of Leviticus 23 symbolizes Jesus offering us as firstfruits before the Lord after the rapture. Quote, "And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the firstfruits as a wave offering before the Lord, with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest." Quote. This connection between Pentecost and the conception comet is made through none other than the highly symbolic number of 490, the number in Daniel chapter 9 that refers to the arrival of the Messiah and the timing of the end times. It is 490 days divided by pi from the conception comet back to the sign on Pentecost on June 12, 2016. This was when 50 people died at a location of open spiritual rebellion, a gay nightclub, on the day that means 50 in the Jewish calendar. In turn, the conception comet connects to the day of the rapture and beginning of Daniel's 70th week with the number regarding Daniel's 70th week, 490. It is 490 days to March 20th. Supporting this, God has the conception comet connect with the prophetic February 2nd date with the prophetic number 444. February 2nd, in turn, connects to March 20 with the 7 days and 40 days in the flood. God also has the conception comet connect with what is arguably the date with the second highest number of signs pointing to it, after March 20th, December 20th, 2017. It is 400 days from the conception comet to the massively prophetic UN vote in the world's court to officially and formally condemn God by condemning his word on Jerusalem. Here is another beautiful story God is telling in this related diagram. God has added this highly significant supermoon in 2016 to his masterpiece painting surrounding the Revelation 12 sign. According to NASA, a supermoon occurs on average once every 13 months. At the end of 2016, in October, November, and December, there were 3 supermoons in a row. This was quite rare. The middle supermoon on November 13, 2016 was what the mainstream media called a super-duper moon. It was the closest supermoon since 1948. This super-duper moon connected with the super blue blood moon on Tu B'Shavat, which was January 31st, 2018. The connection was via a prophetic 444 days. This super blue blood moon was within 5 days of being exactly 70 years from the supermoon in 1948. God is demonstrating yet again this 70 years from the rebirth of Israel. As Jesus said, a generation from the fig tree bringing forth its leaves in the spring. Studies show that women often bleed together on new moons and ovulate together on full moons. It is typically 3 days after ovulation when an egg can be fertilized. Amazingly, 3 days after this special super-duper moon was when the conception comet sign occurred. It then typically takes 3 more days for a fertilized egg to attach to the womb. Amazingly, 3 days after the conception comet, Jupiter entered the womb of Virgo and began its 42 weeks of circling inside the womb. God is the master artist. Here he orchestrated this beginning of a pregnancy in the sky, the beginning of the Revelation 12 sign. The Revelation 12 sign that points to the birth of the church into heaven. This diagram here is truly profound. It is astonishing, but with this, I believe God has clearly communicated the day the Antichrist will rise to power. Something extremely significant regarding the Antichrist, probably in relation to Israel, should occur on this day. It could be the day the treaty is made with Israel that is described in Daniel chapter 9, an agreement that enables Israel to rebuild the temple. This day of the Antichrist is April Fool's Day, or April 1st, 2018. First of all, how symbolically appropriate that this false prophet of false prophets, whose role is to deceive the masses, would rise to world leader on April Fool's Day. This coming April Fool's Day will also coincide with Easter Sunday, the first time this has occurred since 1956. April Fool's Day has Catholic origins. What is astounding is that the Pope has decided to enact a power he has to change dates for Catholics and declare that this year there will not be an April Fool's Day. Instead, next year there will be 2 April Fool's Days. This power of the popes to change laws regarding dates has not been enacted since July 15, 1782, when the then pope canceled the date of his brother's birthday because of an argument. The reason this is absolutely astounding is because of a prophetic passage in Daniel chapter 7 regarding the Antichrist. Quote, "And he shall think to change the times and the law," quote. That the Pope is enacting his power to change the law regarding a date on this day that God is clearly revealing as Antichrist Day is amazing. Arguably, the biggest mark the Roman Catholic Church has had on history is changing the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. I believe it is likely that the mark of the beast, prophesied in the book of Revelation, will include mandatory worship on Sundays. It is written that conforming to this false religious worship and taking this mark of the beast will be a ticket to eternal separation from God. Incidentally, for those that study prophecy, the 1,260 in this same passage also refers to the 1,260 years of religious as well as temporal authority the Pope held from 538 AD to 1798, when Napoleon stripped the Pope's temporal powers. The beast's mortal wound that is healed in Revelation 13:3 refers to the Pope regaining temporal power over the world. I realize many are looking for an Islamic Antichrist, but Scripture does not support this. Quote, the Assyrian quote in Micah 5 is a metaphor for the Antichrist prototype, which was Antiochus Epiphanes. just as Mystery Babylon is a metaphor for Rome. Not only is this April Fool's a day when the Antichrist Pope is changing a date, but 6,666 days prior to this day is Y2K. This is stunning. This was New Year's Eve in 1999, when the mainstream media was hyping up a possible doomsday due to the internet and computers malfunctioning, when the date changed to the year 2000. So here we have this day of the Pope changing the date, connecting to a doomsday scenario that was all about dates changing. This connection is made through none other than the Antichrist's number, 666. It is also 666 days prior to this April Fool's Antichrist Day, to the very prophetic day on June 3rd, 2016. Again, this was the day of the Paris talks to divide Israel without Israel, coinciding with the peak of the epic floods in Paris, as well as the day the two ceremonial jets crashed that were number 6 in their squads, one being a Blue Angels jet that crashed right after flying over Obama's speech, thus being a sign that he is the second beast in the book of Revelation, with jets that are number 6, 666 days back from Antichrist Day. Also, 222 days prior to this April Fool's Antichrist Day is the Great American Eclipse Sign of Jonah judgment sign. First, the reason the number 222 is profound is because it was the year 222 AD that the title of Bishop of Rome was first used. This title later became Pope. The reason why it is extremely profound that Antichrist Day points to the day of this eclipse is because of the eclipse's path of totality it marked on the map. This path, and the path of totality of the next American eclipse in 2024 that will also divide America on the map 7 years after the Great American Eclipse, together procure an X mark on the map. This is a Tav mark, a mark of Shibboleth for God placed by angels on the foreheads of those that were spared the destruction of Jerusalem in the book of Ezekiel chapter 9. As with many things that are the inverse in the New Testament from the Old Testament, this Tav mark on the foreheads given by the Antichrist will be their demise, not salvation. I need to mention that it is my theory that the mark of the beast may not be an actual literal mark. The hand and forehead are metaphors in the book of Deuteronomy 11:18. From April Fool's Antichrist Day, it is 70 days back to January 21st and the day of the launch of what is called the Humanity Star, what is in reality the Antichrist Star of Bethlehem. Let's quickly take a look at January 21st before returning to this Antichrist Day diagram. As shown in this diagram, there are a number of day counts pointing to this date of January 21st that together imply that they could only have been procured by God. It was 153 days from the sign of Jonah and impending judgment sign that was the Great American Eclipse on August 21st to January 21st. The number 153 is the mysterious number given in the book of John, chapter 21, that symbolizes the harvest of fish and the length of time of the church age. Also, from the beginning of Jesus' ministry in 29 AD, it is 153 times 13, or 1,989 years, until 2018. Here, the number 13 symbolizes Jesus plus the 12 apostles that began the church age. Additionally, it is 120 days from the Revelation 12 verses 1 to 2 sign on September 23rd until January 21st. Again, God gave Noah the number 120 as the length of time until judgment and the flood. It is also 70 days from the Revelation 12 verse 5 sign, Star of Bethlehem, Jupiter-Venus conjunction, on November 13th until January 21st. The number 70 is the length of time of judgment on Israel when they were exiled to Babylon. 70 sets of 7 years is also the length of time in Daniel chapter 9 that concerns God's plan for the Jews and the arrival of the Messiah. As well, 2018 is the 70th anniversary of the rebirth of Israel in 1948. Why did God point to January 21st? First, the Humanity Star was launched this day. This satellite's sole purpose is to reflect light and be observed by everyone on Earth. Its creators also have a political message behind it, one of humanism and socialism. Quote, "For us to thrive and survive, we need to make big decisions in the context of humanity as a whole, not in context of individuals, organizations, or even nations. The Humanity Star is a way of looking beyond our immediate situation, whatever that may be, and understanding we are all in this together as one species, collectively responsible for innovating and solving the challenges facing us. We must come together as a species to solve the really big issues like climate change and resource shortages." Quote, "This Humanity Star encapsulates much of the politics of the Antichrist and his spirit, that of a new collective world order that focuses on the wrong issues and tries to solve them without God. That this satellite was launched on this day, marked by God, just days before the beginning of the end times, clearly makes this the Antichrist Star of Bethlehem. Further supporting this is that it is expected to come back to Earth about 9 months later. Thus, like the Star of Bethlehem, it is symbolizing a birth. In this case, the birth of the Antichrist, with his humanist and socialist agenda the world will love. From the day of the Antichrist Star of Bethlehem, it is 17 days to the launch of another Antichrist sign in the sky. First, in the Bible, the number 17 is associated with the timing of the reign of a king. The timing of the reigns of Joseph in Egypt, Rehoboam, Ahaziah, and Jehu are all associated with the number 17. In this diagram, 17 refers to the soon-to-be time of the reign of the Antichrist. On February 6, 2018, Elon Musk's company SpaceX launched its first commercial heavy rocket. The media was enthralled with the event, and watching the reusable rockets return to Earth and land safely was spectacular. The rocket launched Tesla's new Roadster, the world's fastest car, into space. What is very interesting are the many examples of Antichrist symbolism surrounding this event. First, the company names its space missions Dragon missions, and it has 6,000 employees. Making its way to the Red Planet, this red Roadster car symbolizes the red horse in the book of Revelation and Zechariah. The red horseman is the Antichrist if Revelation chapters 7 and 6 are read in reverse chronological order, as I believe they are meant to be. This reverse chronological order puts the rapture first and makes the white horseman Christ. This makes sense not only because Christ is riding a white horse in Revelation 19, and because otherwise the red and white horsemen in Revelation 6 are redundant, but because the white horseman has no arrows and instead has a bow, that is a rainbow, at the end of judgment, similar to the rainbow at the end of the flood. This theory is supported by the beasts in Revelation 13 being in reverse chronological order compared with Daniel 7, as John is in the future looking back in time. Therefore, the dummy driving the red Roadster is the red horseman, the Antichrist. At the steering wheel, the dummy also symbolizes independent transhumanism man in charge of his own future destiny without God. Further, the dummy is said to be carrying digital copies of Isaac Asimov books about a future utopia without God, and is listening to David Bowie, a pop idol that used Antichrist symbolism. Elon Musk said he expects the dummy to be contacted by aliens. This is huge because I expect the Pope's rise to Antichrist rule over the world will come through aliens. Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that the power of the Antichrist will come through the deception from Satan. Aliens are demonic deception. I don't have the space here to go into detail, and I recommend you watch my videos numbered 3, 4, and 5, but it is obvious that the Pope will come to power when aliens arrive, claiming to be here to help us, and make the Pope world ambassador. Adding even more weight to this being Antichrist Day is the daily Bible reading for April 1st. As previously shown, God has used daily Bible readings to demonstrate meaning he is conveying. This day's Bible reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 18. It is about warning against abominable false religious practices. It is also a warning against false prophets. How exceedingly appropriate for this daily Bible reading to coincide with Antichrist Day. What is a very interesting addition to this message that God is giving us is that April Fool's Antichrist Day is exactly 49 solar years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 1969. As explained earlier, the decree to rebuild Jerusalem from the prophecy in the book of Daniel chapter 9 is the key date in history that was given by Archangel Gabriel that is used to tell Daniel when the Messiah would arrive. I also explained earlier that 49 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 1969 completes the 69th set of 7 years before the final set of 7 years, or end times. This chapter 9 of Daniel speaks of the Antichrist making a covenant with Israel at the beginning of the end times, presumably allowing the Jews to rebuild the temple. The fact that these Antichrist Day signs incorporate this 49-year connection to Jerusalem and the temple indicates that this is that momentous day when the Jews and the Antichrist reach an agreement, allowing the temple to be rebuilt. Speaking of the first beast in the book of Revelation, that is the Antichrist, a presidential portrait of the second beast in the book of Revelation was unveiled on February 12th. Obama is depicted in a garden, quite a break from tradition with other past presidential portraits. This painting carries with it serpent in the garden symbolism. In Genesis chapter 2, the serpent in the garden is Satan. The uncanny garden symbolism between the two beasts goes further. When Obama met the Pope in the Vatican in 2014, he gave him seeds of fruits from the White House garden. Fruit, of course, being symbolic of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and seeds representing the seed of Satan in Genesis chapter 3. This was in recognition of the Pope being the first Pope to open the papal gardens to the public. Obama told the Pope he would like him to visit the White House garden. Sure enough, Obama received the Pope at the White House garden, on the south lawn near the Rose Garden and First Lady's garden. This was a very prophetic 2 years, exactly before the Revelation 12 sign on September 23, 2015. 2 years carries a lot of symbolic meaning in the Bible. That these two leaders met exactly 2 years before the Revelation 12 sign in the garden is astounding. It makes it very clear that these two are the two beasts in the end times. During the White House visit, Obama gave the Pope a statue of a peace dove. This is interesting due to the sign we received when the Pope's two peace doves were immediately killed upon release by a crow and a seagull in view of everyone. While in the U.S., the Pope conducted Mass at Madison Square Gardens. This is an image of the Pope sitting at a concert in Philadelphia that I think is revealing of the Pope's occultism. The backdrop is Baphomet. Here's an image of the Pope sitting on his creepy pits of hell throne. Here in this diagram, we can see that God is using the Mayan calendar doomsday date of December 21st, 2012. This was the doomsday of the New Age religion. He is using this date to point to a number of very prophetic biblical dates through very prophetic numbers. That in turn point to the beginning of the end times. In other words, he is mocking the New Age religion by demonstrating that the Bible is his true revelation, not the New Age religion or a pagan calendar. Satan is the master deceiver, and he counterfeits God consistently. For example, Islam has a counterfeit end times eschatology. Eschatology means theology of the end period and final destiny of mankind. In Islam, they call what is the biblical Antichrist, their savior, the Mahdi, that will come at the end and slaughter the infidels and cause the world to submit to Islam. I don't have space for detail here, but the opposite and inverse parallels between the Islamic end times and the Bible's end times are uncanny, and it is obvious that Satan inspired Islamic eschatology. To be clear though, although the end times will deceive Muslims, they are not going to unfold in a Christian versus Islam scenario with an Islamic Antichrist. The dominant religion in our culture today is the New Age religion. Ultimately a religion of self-worship, the New Age adopts a pantheistic form of divinity that imbues the entire universe, including human beings themselves. Their Satan-inspired counterfeit of the end times claims that the second coming is a metaphor for their coming New Age of enlightenment for mankind. A religion rooted in Eastern theology, their belief system of a collective consciousness claims that Jesus was an enlightened master that attained this collective, quote, Christ consciousness, quote. What is relevant in this diagram is that the New Age religion counterfeit calls the coming end times, quote, earth changes, quote. In their theology, the earth is itself a collectively conscious being that will act to reduce the human population that is a parasite polluting the planet and an obstacle to planetary spiritual renewal. Rather than being the prophesied, quote, birth pains, quote, before the millennial reign of Christ from Jerusalem, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and meteors will come from the earth goddess that is cleansing herself of the parasites, making room for a new, more enlightened humanity. This worldview is pure evil. Yet the evil New Age religion, a religion able to incorporate all religions under its umbrella through a belief that all worldviews and religions are connected and lead to the same destiny, will be the new world religion in the end times. In this diagram, we can see that God has demonstrated that this worldview is a lie by connecting the New Age or doomsday with biblically prophetic dates through very prophetic numbers. The Mayan calendar supposedly ended on December 21st, 2012. God connects this date with the very prophetic 1,260 days to the June 3rd, 2016 sign. Again, this was the day of the Paris talks to divide Israel without Israel, the peak of the epic 200-year destructive flood in Paris, coinciding with the day the two ceremonial jets crashed that were number 6 in their squads, one of which was a Blue Angels jet, a fallen angel, that crashed right after flying over Obama giving his commencement speech. This day in turn connects to the beginning of the end times on March 20th. God also connects this New Age doomsday with a very prophetic 1,131 days to the Jewish New Year for trees and day of watching for signs in 2016. As explained earlier, this number is 360 times pi. Both are numbers of a circle, and this number is broken into 777 and 354, the number of days in a lunar year. God also connects this New Age counterfeit doomsday with the very prophetic 1,440 days to the UN vote against Israel on November 30th, 2016. Again, this vote was 153 nations to 7 nations. Also again, from John chapter 21, it was 7 disciples that hauled in the net of 153 fish that symbolizes the souls harvested at the end of the church age. Also, as shown earlier, the number 1,440 is the very prophetic number associated with the times of the Gentiles before the Messianic kingdom. Also, it is 777 days, God's number, to the day after the Jewish New Year for trees and day for watching for signs in 2015. Yet on this Jewish New Year for trees and day for watching for signs in the US, after 3 p.m. Central Time, it was the next day in Israel, and therefore a connection with 777 days is made. Clearly, God has demonstrated the truth about New Age beliefs through these connections that could have only been procured by the God of Israel and the God of the Bible. I have cut and isolated this segment of this video on the New Age and posted it on my second YouTube channel, clearlywritten.net too. I strongly encourage you to go there, copy the link, and send it to those that have New Age beliefs. This includes people that have devoted their lives to it, to those that practice yoga and a vegetarian diet. Essentially, almost everyone in our culture today. The New World religion in the Antichrist kingdom will center around New Age beliefs. Daniel 11:38, speaking of the Antichrist, quote, "But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not," quote. An interesting news story surfaced on Valentine's Day. A man in Manhattan was killed by a piece of fire escape that had fallen 7 floors. I believe this story is a warning sign from God. First, the man's name was March Hart. It was Valentine's Day, but as we have seen, the signs indicate that the rapture and beginning of the end times is in the heart of March. Second, the piece of debris fell 7 floors. The 7 number implies the touch of God, and this symbolism implies the debris fell from on high and to look up to God. Third, it was a piece of fire escape. The symbolism here is fire from above, which is spoken of in the 7th trumpet in the book of Revelation. The escape aspect of the fire escape would imply a call to escape the coming fire, or there won't be an escape. The scene of this accident was on Broadway in Manhattan. This symbolism is a reference to how Jesus told the disciples that the road to destruction is wide and that the door to salvation is narrow. The scene of this accident was also in Lower Manhattan, the place of the 9/11 judgment warning sign, where it was debris that fell on the people. Lastly, the man was 58. If we insert 2 sevens from the 7 floors symbolism, a plurality of the number 7, in between the 5 and the 8, we get 5778. The current Hebrew year and the year of the beginning of the end times is 5778. Here are a few last diagrams that reveal how awesome our God is. I would like to encourage everyone to share this with as many people as possible, especially those that have not yet come to faith. If we all pass this on to 7 others that have not yet come to believe,